I did. Sarah?
Yes.
Is that a see-through blouse?
Probably, yes. Absolutely, 100%. That's why I'm wearing a nude bra. Thanks, Walmart. No, I'm just kidding.
You can't see the good stuff.
Thanks, Walmart. Just kidding.
Says he's got the camera above your nipples. So you know. 1 minute out, silence on the set.
What a bunch. What a bunch of clowns.
Excuse me, down here. Dun-dun-dun.
Were we being silent?
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to VashonLIVE. We are gearing up for another beautiful week in paradise. Thanks for joining us. So happy Thursday to everybody. We have a really great show tonight, but I want to tell you a little bit about what we have going on all weekend. So tomorrow, we have our very own Tim Couldn't Make It. So tomorrow, Friday, you will have Rick Doms and Doug Pine will be here playing music. And I'm so excited because I feel like this is sort of their clubhouse, so it's gonna be really cool to have them here live. On Saturday, we have Mary Catherine, and Mary Catherine is a young woman, songwriter, guitar player, singer. She is our first youth performer, besides a solo performer, because we had Basement Tuesdays before. So we're really excited about being able to help bring youthful, young entertainers to VashonLIVE and get them sort of their start. So maybe by the time this pandemic is over, they'll actually be able to get on a real stage and have some comfort. And then on Sunday, we have a real treat. Jeff Kanzler is going to be here. If you don't know Jeff, you're definitely going to want to tune in. Amazing songwriter and singer. It's going to be a real treat. Tonight, we have Will North. Will North is sort of infamous, Vashon famous, as far as I'm concerned. When I think of a writer sitting by the water and writing a novel and all that like moody, romantic sort of ideas of writers, this is who I think of. So he is going to be sharing his book that's actually based here in Vashon, and so you're going to want to check that out. I will have more about him in the comments, ways to donate. He is generously donating his tips tonight to Snapdragon. We're really excited about Snapdragon having new Venmo that's really easy to remember. It's Venmo at Snapdragon-2020. Snapdragon-2020. Very simple. Snapdragon has given this place basically to us to film, has given it to the community to be able to bring this art to you. So we are so happy to be able to support them in that way. So share the love with Snapdragon. Also, Snapdragon is now open from 10 a.m. to 3 a.m. Thursday through Sunday. Come by, get a cake, get a pastry, say hello. They've got a big deck out front, so they only allow so many people in the building at a time, but we would love to see your faces. So without further ado, enjoy Will North.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to the whole remarkable crew here in this studio. It's amazing what they have turned the Snapdragon into. It's a full-fledged television studio, and I'm honored to be here, and I'm delighted to be able to be part of this VashonLIVE scene. Contrary to advertisements you may have seen on Facebook, I am in fact not going to be reading from my latest book, which is the fourth in a series of murder mysteries set in Cornwall, England, called A Commons Murder. Why? Well, one, I haven't finished it yet. Two, it has nothing to do with Vashon, whereas this book, called Season's End, is set right here on Vashon, and I thought it might be more fun to read from that. I'm going to start just by reading the summary that the publisher put on the back of this book, because it'll give you a concise picture of what the whole story is about, because we're only going to look at the very beginning. So here we go. Every summer for generations, 3 families intertwined by history, marriage, and career have spent the season at their beach cottage compounds on an island in Puget Sound. Today, Martha Pete Peterson, married to Tyler Strong, is the linchpin of the summer people. In childhood, she was the tomboy every girl wanted to emulate, and she is now the mother that everyone admires. Colin Ryan, a family friend and the island's veterinarian, met Pete first in London many years earlier when she visited his roommate in London, Tyler. But he's loved her privately ever since. Born in Manhattan's Hell's Kitchen, son of a bar owner, he's always been dazzled by what he sees of the sun-kissed lives of the wealthy summer people. But this summer, currents strong as the tides are roiling, jealousies grow, tempers flare, passions clash. Then, on the last day of the season, a series of betrayals alters the combined histories of all of these families forever. Chapter 1. At first, he thought it was a deer. It was not quite morning on what promised to be yet another brilliant end-of-summer day. The pre-dawn fog was just beginning to lift. Not that it actually ever lifted, not that it was fog either, come to that. It's just what islanders called the queer maritime phenomenon because marine layer was too fussy a phrase for an everyday event. In the wee hours, it lay like a lid 100 feet or so above the ground in late summer, and as the upper air warmed, plumes of mist descended and rose, twisting wraith-like through the feathered branches of the firs that cloaked the island. Then, at a certain but hardly uncertain point later in the morning, and the regulars at the Burton coffee stand sometimes bet on the precise moment, it simply disappeared. And it reminded him of the steam coming from the manholes in the Manhattan streets he remembered from his childhood. The fog didn't actually move off the way clouds do. Instead, in a kind of meteorological sleight of hand, it just vanished. You'd miss it entirely if you didn't pay close attention. But Colin Ryan paid close attention. Though it was only the first Monday of September and the night had been warm, on this morning's bike ride, Colin could already sense the coming autumn chill. It was there in the sharper tang of the air that swept in from the Pacific, and in the subtle shift in the quality of light as the transit of the sun took a lower, more southerly route across the sky. It was there in the way the echoing honks of migrating geese began to replace the shrieks of laughter of the children in the cold water who summered at the beach. It was there in the way the leaves of the alders and the broadleaf maples of this mostly evergreen island would, in a matter of a few weeks, not so much change color as slowly lighten as they died, reverting to the pale greens of spring, as if the movie of the seasons was spinning backwards. Summer did not flame out in the Pacific Northwest as it did in Colin's native Northeast. It slipped gracefully off stage. And here in the middle of Puget Sound, surrounded by the perpetually snow-capped Olympic Mountains to the west and the Cascades to the east, Colin thought that was perfectly appropriate. Flash was unnecessary when grandeur was everywhere. But in the thin half-light of dawn, he could tell the end was approaching, the gathering autumn already sucking the marrow from the fat bones of summer. There were still warm days, though, and he was taking full advantage. He was nearing the end of his pre-dawn ride, an 8-mile circumnavigation of the southern half of the island, something he did every morning before opening the clinic as long as the weather held. It had been nearly 2 decades since he moved to the island to take over the local veterinary practice. Colin was hunched over his handlebars and speeding south along the steep, sinuous stretch of the Vashon Highway just south of the little hamlet called Burton, the tires of his touring bike hissing over the dew-damp asphalt like tape being ripped from a dispenser. And then he saw the dark mass ahead in the middle of the road. Now, deer were a year-round menace on Vashon Island, but the danger worsened as fall approached, as if in their frenzy to pack on as much weight as possible to carry them through the winter, the beasts became senseless to the danger whenever they saw an irresistible patch of grass. Given the dark canopy of the conifer forest, many of these irresistible patches were along the sunny margins of the island's narrow roads. The Vashon Highway was nothing more than a 2-lane blacktop that stretched from the ferry dock at the north end of the island to its opposite number on the south end, some 13 miles away. The rather grand title of highway dated from the time not so very long ago when the south and north end ferries were finally joined by a continuous paved road, a measure of progress and a point of local pride requiring a suitably proud name. Whenever Colin looked at a road map of the island, which he did a lot because he made a lot of farm calls, the pattern of perpendicular side roads branching off the highway reminded him of the spine and the ribs of a deboned salmon. Colin squeezed his brake levers hard and slid to a stop on the slick pavement at a point where the road leveled out along the north shore of outer Quartermaster Harbor. In the dim light, just pearling the sky to the east, he noticed a great blue heron hunched on an arm of driftwood at the water's edge, motionless as an undertaker. He unclipped from the pedals, leaned his bike against the guardrail, and crossed the road, his cycling shoes clicking on the pavement like a metronome. In another half hour, traffic for the morning's first Tacoma-bound ferry at the south end of the island would pick up, and even though it was Labor Day, the now deserted road would get busy. Colin knew he'd have to drag the deer to the side of the road so there wasn't another accident. It wasn't the first time he'd done it. He wondered what had happened to the car that had hit the beast. At this hour, it would have been some old beater of a pickup belonging to an island laborer, the kind of fellow least likely to be able to afford repairs, the most economically vulnerable to any accident, whether personal or vehicular. They often had a well-loved old dog who rode with them, and Colin took care of their animals when they were sick, often for nothing. As he came closer to the inert carcass on the asphalt, though, he realized, even in the dim pre-dawn light, that there was a problem with this particular deer. Instead of the usual flea-bitten russet coat, this one was wearing a short black cocktail dress and silver high-heeled sandals, and wasn't a deer. The body lay on its back, but the head was turned away, the face curtained behind a swirl of sun-streaked ash-blonde hair. The slender tan limbs lay splayed across the pavement like a child's pickup sticks. He didn't need to see the face. He recognized the dress. He'd admired it and the woman who wore it only hours earlier at the annual beachside party the old summer families always held the night before Labor Day, the day before they all left the island for the winter. The body belonged to Martha Peterson Strong, known to everyone on the beach as Pete. He had known her and loved her for more than 20 years. Colin knelt by the body in the middle of the road. The mist-thick northwest forest around and above them was so quiet he could hear the blood pumping in his ears. Somewhere, far across Quartermaster Harbor, he could hear the high whine of an outboard running south from Dockton to the deep water channel beyond, where the salmon were running. Along the roadside was a bank of overripe wild blackberries that, in the dewy air, breathed the fragrance of cassis. Even the gulls were quiet, as if the fog were a blanket beneath which they slumbered. He leaned forward and placed his hand at the top of the bony corduroy of ribs radiating from Pete's sternum. He had never done anything so intimate with her before. He marveled how so petite a woman who had borne 3 children could still look delicate as blown glass. Her skin was cold, and yet he thought he felt a heartbeat. He placed 2 fingers lightly on the carotid artery in her neck, and her eyelids, smudged with mascara, fluttered open like bruised wings. He jerked his hand away. "Jesus, Pete, I thought you were dead." But the seawater eyes never focused. Pete Peterson Strong was not dead, but she was nearly comatose, and he guessed, now that he was close enough to smell, dangerously drunk. Gently, he opened her slack jaws and checked her throat for vomit. The principal cause of death and causes of alcohol poisoning, he knew, wasn't the alcohol itself, it was asphyxiation. Alcohol suppresses the gag reflex, but her throat looked clear. With an uneasy sense of intimate invasion, he felt her limbs and torso in the dim light for signs of any injury and found none obvious. He stared at her dark form for a moment and just shook his head. There was no reasonable explanation for her to be here on the double yellow line of the Vashon Highway south of Burton. No reason except intention. He slipped his arms beneath her shoulders and knees and, as if he were lifting a large dog at the clinic, pulled her toward him and rose in one fluid movement. He carried her across the road to the shoreside verge, leaned her back against the steel guardrail, then removed a light rain shell from the holder behind his bicycle seat. He had just begun to slip her arms through it when, in the gathering of the light from the east, he noticed bluish bruises ringing her bird-like arms just above the wrists. He zipped up the jacket, tried to make sense of the welts, and couldn't. A few yards away, its vigil disturbed, the great blue heron unfurled its vast smoky wings, hauled itself into the air, skimming low above the harbor's surface, and croaked loud complaints to the dawn. Pete's breathing was slow and shallow, but not irregular. He had no idea how long she'd lain in the road, and he knew he needed to get her someplace warm and safe. Someplace safe. He looked again at the wrist injuries. Almost certainly they were bruises of restraint. But why? How? He couldn't imagine Tyler hurting his wife, and yet he couldn't imagine who else could have caused those injuries in the very few hours since he'd seen the two of them last. Fury rose in his throat. No wonder she'd fled. He knew so much about them, and yet, really, so little. What could have happened? Why would she choose this kind of end? For years, he'd been made to feel a part of their family and intimate. But he actually knew nothing, really, about this woman he held dear to his heart, nor about the husband he thought of as a years-long friend. He knew nothing. He was, as he always had been, the outsider. It had been the traditional Madrona Beach Labor Day weekend ritual, one Colin had seen no news had changed little for generations. 3 families, the Petersons, the Strongs, and the Rutherfords, owned the half a dozen or more houses and cottages scattered across the gently rising ground above the water. Each family had, over the years, established its own compound. But the families only summered at the beach. The rest of the year, the houses lay empty, staring blank-eyed out over the water and shuddering through the winter storms that flung salt spume over their lawns and ripped shingles off the rooftops. Labor Day weekend was the end of the 2-month rolling house party that was the season among the summer people. They arrived just before the 4th of July and departed on Labor Day, their various SUVs and minivans crammed to the roof with children, dogs, cats, sports equipment, beachwear, and so forth. It had been, in most respects, the usual last night boozy bash, the careening children, the overindulging adults, the hours-long communal dinner, and the end-of-season fireworks on the beach, a kind of melancholy echo of the 4th of July festivities that started the season off. But this year, it seemed to Colin that there was something else, an edginess, like distant atonal music, the source of which he'd not been able to identify. There was sarcasm over cocktails, discord during dinner, as if the season had lasted just a bit too long and too much sun had left everyone tender and cranky. And now there was this. He placed a hand on the livid wrist of the unconscious woman beside him and wondered what extremity of hopelessness had brought her to this point. Jesus, Pete, why didn't you say something? Colin couldn't leave her to get help, and he tried to will an early pickup truck to pass so he could flag it down, but the road was empty and quiet. He knew the sensible thing was to get Pete to the island's medical clinic a few miles to the north, but he also knew that if he did so, the news of Pete's attempted suicide would race across the island like a forest fire, and the Strongs and Petersons would be furious. Even in an emergency, and wasn't this one, they would consider it betrayal. And yet he certainly couldn't take her back home to Tyler, not with those wrist bruises. He looked at his watch. Another 20 minutes before the ferry traffic picked up, he put his arms around the woman he had never quite stopped loving and tried to warm her. There was no response, not a sound, not a reflex. In the east, the sky was brightening, and as the sun began to slice shafts through the drifting mist, Colin heard what sounded like the low gurgle of the engine of an antique Chris Craft motor cruiser coming from the direction of Burton. Fog had a habit of making ventriloquists of any noise source, and it seemed to him this old yacht was motoring right down the highway instead of across the outer harbor. The anomaly resolved itself moments later when an ancient white Cadillac Coupe de Ville rumbled out of the brightening swirl of fog and came to a halt beside them. To say that the automobile was white was a stretch. It had spent decades parked beneath an ancient cedar and in the tree's perpetually damp shadow. It had developed a kind of patina of green algae that blotched the vast sheet metal expanse of its hood and trunk like a pox. The once glacially white vinyl roof now supported colonies of native mosses as if the vehicle were a traveling exhibit of local flora. Colin recognized the car immediately. Edwina Rutherford, known to everyone on the island as Miss Edwina, pressed a button and miraculously, given the age of the mechanism, her window descended. The elderly driver nodded once and said, "I thought so." Then she negotiated a lurching three-point turn in the middle of the road, pulled up beside them, activated the passenger window, and said, "Get her in." Colin lifted Pete from the roadside and laid her on her side on the burgundy-crushed velvet rear seat. Then he swung his bike into the caddy's cavernous trunk and joined the driver in the front seat. "Good morning, Miss Edwina." "The hell it is," she shouted. Edwina Rutherford favored purple as a wardrobe color of universal utility and appeal. She was wearing a faded purple terry cloth robe and had a patterned purple silk scarf wrapped turban-like around her head. She'd had cancer years earlier, and her hair had never grown back with its former luxuriance, so she shaved her head and wrapped it in scarves ever since. She was a large woman with a face as weathered as lichen-crusted roof shingles. Despite her advancing years, and Colin guessed she was easily 80, she had a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue. "Goddamn nuisance is what this is." She gunned the engine and the car vaulted through the drifting feathers of the fog. The mist would burn off early. "Were you on your way to the ferry?" Colin asked. The driver shot him a look. "No, I saw her. I hate getting up at this ungodly hour." Where did you see her?" "In my dream, you imbecile. Where do you think?" "Miss Edwina, she was trying to commit suicide." "Does that give her the right to wake me? People are so damned inconsiderate." "You saw this?" Colin asked, as Edwina rocketed through the 25-mile-per-hour beachside stretch of the highway just below Burton. "No, I just like to take impulsive pre-dawn drives when visibility is zero, although with my old eyes it hardly matters anymore." Would you like me to drive?" "Don't be impertinent." She took the curve up into Burton wide and fast, pounded the brake pedal like she was trying to stamp out a fire, and managed to bring the automobile to a shuddering halt at the blinking red light between the Harbor Inn and the Burton Mercantile General Store. "Where to, Doc?" she said. "Well, you're the psychic. Why don't you tell me? And you're a New Yorker. Does wise ass just come in the water there with the fluoride, or are you special?" "Geez, Miss Edwina, cut me some slack. I don't know where. The health clinic is out, the families would go ballistic, and we can't take her home like this." "No shit, Sherlock. Not with those wrists." "Wait, you saw that too?" "No, I just make this stuff up." The old lady stared at him and drummed her bony fingers on the steering wheel, waiting. No, Edwina. My place is out." "Though that's where she belongs." "What?" "Don't what me, young man. You know damn well what. You love her. You have for years. Not that it did a damn bit of good, because she never understood the first thing about you, and I don't know which of you is dimmer. For you for loving her when it's hopeless, or her for never having seen it. Lame, the both of you are." A horn honked behind them. The first of the South End ferry traffic had arrived. Edwina lowered her window and gave the impatient driver behind her the finger. No one honked on this island. Colin leaned his head on the dusty dashboard. All right, let's take her to my place. About time is what I say. Miss Edwina, with respect, what you say is not always right. The hell it isn't. She gunned the big V8 again and roared away from the light, which continued blinking as if it had simply been marking time while they argued. A mile further north, just past the Judd Creek Bridge, she swung the caddy right onto Quartermaster Drive, and just after the narrow neck of fill called the portage that connected the main island to its little sister, Maury Island, she yanked the car left and up the hill to the bluff overlooking Tramp Harbor. How do you know where I live? The old woman just stared at him. You're scary, Miss Edwina. I know. It keeps people on their toes. So, whenever I do a reading at a bookstore, inevitably someone will ask me two questions. Where do you get your ideas? Where'd the characters come from? And I have learned to say, Toledo. I don't know what else to say. Because the fact of the matter is, this is a very imprecise art. And frankly, these people just show up. And they start telling me what to do and bossing me around, and I often feel like I'm just taking dictation. I love what I do. I love writing fiction. I love creating stories that affect people. And I love creating characters. You know, they're sometimes hard to believe. And so that is the opening to Season's End, my third novel out of 7 so far, and the only one that's set here on Vashon Island. I thank you for listening, and I appreciate your attention. Thank you.